Hi and welcome again. Episode number 8 of our series on web service design and web service insights. The last episode, if you watched it, talked about something a little more out of the way compared to normal web services, and that was about slow reports or what we call slow queries. When you have slow queries, you have an operation which can't be done in a few seconds, which means it's not suitable to be done synchronously through a web service. That is when you need to figure out a way to queue the job, put it somewhere else, have something which is running asynchronously in the background, executing the job, and so on and so forth. So that is how long-running reports, long-running queries are handled in our framework or in our approach. This episode will take the idea one step further. This episode is going to talk about what happens when you need to process a batch. So, business applications are today built in the form of web services on the server side. That doesn't change. But you also need to process activities which are not naturally suitable for the web service type synchronous rapid call, rapid request response architecture. So how do you handle a batch for a file? Now in that kind of a scenario, what we do is we have a standardized module, template, whatever, which is part of our web application development framework called Remiges Alya. Now, you don't have to use Alya, but if you do, we'll be very happy. It's open source, download it and use it. It's available in Java and Go. But it's the basic idea, the basic insights and the basic design that we are going to discuss today. The fact that it is already implemented in Alya is just a bonus. So what we need to do here is we need to handle a file that comes in. Yes, business applications even today in the 21st century are doing large bulk data transfer in the form of asynchronous file upload and download. So we need to pick up a file which is submitted to us on the server. We need to parse that file into individual lines. We need to process each line and we need to generate some sort of a response. So how do we do this? So the basic pieces are as follows. There is a file transfer server which is preferably for security reasons separate from our server which is running our web services. So that file transfer server exists. It receives files, it generates files for download. So it receives files which are uploaded to it and it generates files which are downloaded from it. Then you need two web services. One is init to create a batch and one is done to check whether the batch is finished or not. And you need worker threads in the main servers and you need an object store to store the files. So this is basically what are the moving pieces which allow you to handle a batch. Okay. So what is a batch? A batch is typically a file, maybe a text file, which will contain 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 or 1,000,000 lines, text lines typically. They could be text, they could be XML. Text is very common. So each line is the equivalent of one transaction. Basically, somebody is asking your system to execute a very large set of transactions in one go. That is a batch. A large set of operations in one go, that is a batch. So we receive the file, your server has to receive the file, your server has to parse the file, identify each line, analyze the shape of the line to make sure that it exactly conforms to the format that you have in mind in terms of what are the fields you want, what are the data values you want in each line. Then if the file is syntactically correct, then you put it into your transaction processing system in a very large number of orders or very large number of operations which are then executed by a large number of asynchronous threads. That's the basic idea. So the first piece is the file transfer server. What does the file transfer server do? It receives then uploaded file which is being submitted to your organization by a counterparty. it runs what we call L1 validations. L1 is level 1 validations. This is just the terms we use. A level 1 validation is basically looking at the file syntactically to see that the lines are correct. There are the correct number of columns per line. The values in each field are all syntactically correct, which means a phone number looks like a phone number and an email address looks like an email address, etc., etc., without cross-checking the data against the database in the system. So all validations which can be done purely standalone, purely syntactically, without cross-checking against any other data store is what we call a level 1 validation. So that level 1 validation is done within the file transfer server. So after it runs the L1 validations, it picks up the records which have come from the text file and it calls a web service called batch init. What does batch init do? Batch init basically picks up, it's a request where you are telling your system to initialize or start a new batch. So it comes with a batch ID. So the file transfer server calls your web service. The web service name is batch init. Batch init returns a batch ID and it puts that batch ID in a batch table somewhere in your database. Now what does the file transfer server do? It picks up these lines and it pushes these lines in the form of messages or blocks of messages. One block contains maybe 50 lines or 100 lines. It creates these messages and each message contains a block of lines and pushes them over the message bus to your server. The server picks up, your servers then will pick up these messages and start processing them. After the file transfer server pushes out all these lines, it starts polling another web service called batch done. When it calls batch done, it passes the batch ID to see is the batch done, and so on. Once the batch is actually completed, the file transfer server receives, yes, okay, the batch is completed. Then it pulls out the results in a web service response or in an object from the object store. So things may not be 100% clear right now, but let's just go with the flow. We will see what happens next. Okay? I'm fairly certain things will get cleared up in the next couple of slides. To be able to implement this batches approach, the batches subsystem, we need two tables. One is a batches table and one is a batch rows table. The batches table contains one record per batch, and the batch rows table contains one record per row of a batch. So if I have received two batches, each batch is of 100,000 rows. So we have 200,000 rows coming in the form of two files. The batches record will have the batches table will have two records. One for batch 1, one for batch 2. The batch rows table will have 200,000 records. One record for each row in each file. So this is the basic database infrastructure required for the batch processing module to work. The batch init call writes a record in the batches table and initializes empty records in the batch rows table and returns a batch ID. The batch done web service checks whether the batches table to see whether the batch is complete or not. Everything, the real action all happens outside these web services. One web service creates a new batch, one web service checks whether the batch is complete. In between has to be the real processing, and that comes somewhere else. We'll look at that now. The worker function. The worker function actually processes one record at a time from the batch rows table. So the real hard work is done by the worker function. It runs inside in the case of Java, it runs inside the JVM, which is running Java Spring Boot. And in the case of Go, it is running inside the Go process, which is running Go and Gin. So the worker function is an asynchronous thread running inside this machine. You can call it a process, a Unix process or whatever. So this thread picks up one record at a time from the batch rows table, processes it and writes an output. All the business logic of what is to be done for your batch is in the worker function. So as a software developer, as a business application developer, you need to write the code for your worker function. So you write the batch init function, you write the batch done function, which are tiny web services. and you write the worker function which does all the hard work. So what do you actually specify? What do you write when you have an infrastructure like this? You write the validation function which runs inside the file transfer server, because that validation function does the superficial validation of your file. You have to write that. You have to write batch init and batch done, and you have to write one worker function which is used for the actual processing. That's it. So your entire batch processing, the entire management of asynchronous processes and files, etc., are all done by the scaffolding code, but the per batch additional software that you need to develop is just this much. So suppose your application has to handle 5 types of batches. If that is what you need, then you need to write for each type of batch, you need to write one batch init, one batch done, one worker function, and one validation function which will run inside your file transfer server. So with these 4 chunks of code, you implement one more batch type. So if you have 5 batch types, 5 into 4 small chunks of code. Once the framework is ready, this is all you need to write for adding a new type of batch. So this covers our episode where we have described how a batch processing implementation can be tied together with web service based software, server-side software, to give you asynchronous distributed batch processing in your modern business application. Now, it's very interesting to note that in the modern architecture where we all develop our business applications, the application server is not a single server. You can have 5 application servers. So these application servers are receiving web service requests from the outside, and they are sharing the load. They might be hitting a common database, but there are multiple application servers. Now, when we implement batch processing in the way in which I have just described, the batch rows table contains all the records which need to be processed. Right? The batch rows table is accessible from all 5 application servers. And the worker functions are there in all 5 application servers. So in effect, what you are doing is you are distributing the batch processing load across as many servers as you have. If you talk containers, you are distributing your batch processing load automatically across as many containers as are running. So this is a fantastic way, a fantastic framework for distributing heavy batch processing loads, making them horizontally scalable simply by adding more servers or adding more containers. So the framework is very horizontally scalable, and the amount of code the software developer needs to write to add one more batch type is relatively small and very well structured. So it all begins to fit into a beautiful framework which allows you to implement batch processing very easily. The framework is already there in Alya, but if you don't use Alya, you can just take our architecture for batch processing and implement it. So with that, we come to the end of episode 8, and I hope this was interesting, and we hope to see you again for the last episode, which is coming soon. Thank you very much. Have fun.